There's a booth at a Denny's in East San Jose. Not a nice Denny's, just a normal one off a normal road with the sticky menus and the coffee that's been sitting there since the morning shift. In 1993, three engineers sat in that booth and drank a lot of bad coffee and decided to start a company. One of them had worked at that exact restaurant chain as a teenager, dishwasher first, then busboy, then waiter. 32 years later, the company they sketched out in that booth became the most valuable company on the face of the earth. And in 2023, Denny's went back and put a plaque on the table. Now, here's the part that gets to me. Everybody tells this story like it was a rocket ship. Three smart guys, one good idea, straight to the moon. That's not what happened, not even a little. That company nearly died in its second year. Its first product was a total flop. Technically wrong, commercially dead, returned by the truckload. Then it spent an entire decade pouring billions of dollars into a feature almost nobody wanted, while Wall Street analysts openly asked what on earth they were doing. So the real question isn't how NVIDIA got lucky with AI. The real question is why they were standing in exactly the right spot when the wave came. After 10 years of everybody telling them they were standing in the wrong place. Let's go back to the beginning, properly. The guy in the booth is Jensen Huang, and his story starts nowhere near Silicon Valley. He was born in Tainan, Taiwan, in 1963. The family moved to Thailand for his father's work. And then, when he was around 9 years old, his parents made a decision that I honestly cannot imagine making. They put him and his older brother on a plane to the United States, alone, to live with an uncle so they could get an American education. The uncle found them a boarding school in Kentucky, except it wasn't really a boarding school. Oneida Baptist Institute was at the time essentially a reform school, kids with real problems. Jensen was a small kid from Taiwan with an accent, and his job every day was cleaning the toilets. He shared a room with a 17-year-old covered in stab wounds who couldn't read. So Jensen taught him to read. And the guy taught Jensen how to bench press. I love that detail so much. That is the whole personality of this company in one anecdote. He got to Oregon, finished high school early, went to Oregon State to study electrical engineering, met his wife in a lab class. He was 16, she was 17, and his opening line was apparently asking if she wanted to see his homework. Then Stanford, then chip companies, AMD and LSI Logic. And that's where the other two come in. Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, both engineers at Sun Microsystems, both frustrated, both convinced there was a company hiding in a problem nobody had solved yet. The problem was this. In the early 90s, your computer's main processor, the CPU, had to do everything. Every calculation, one after another, in a line. Very smart, very flexible, but fundamentally a single genius working through a to-do list. And that's a terrible way to draw a picture, because a screen isn't one problem. It's 2 million tiny problems, all of which need answering at the same time 60 times a second. What color is this pixel? What about this one? And this one? You don't want one genius for that. You want 10,000 people who can each do simple arithmetic, all working at once. So they built the second thing, a chip that's dumber per unit, but does thousands of things simultaneously. Hold that idea because it's the entire story. Everything else is just consequences. They incorporated in April 1993. The name came from NV for next version, which is what they'd been naming their files. And then somebody found the Latin word NVIDIA, which means envy. NVIDIA. Fine. Good enough. Back to work. They raised money from Sequoia Capital, and legend has it that Don Valentine, one of the most famous venture capitalists who ever lived, the guy who backed Apple and Atari, told Jensen something along the lines of, "If you lose my money, don't come back." So no pressure. Their first chip was the NV1 in 1995, and here's where they made a mistake so fundamental it should have been the end of the story. To draw a 3D shape, you have to build it out of something. Almost everyone building 3D graphics settled on triangles. Lots and lots of flat triangles stuck together. It's crude, but it's simple and it's fast. NVIDIA didn't use triangles. They used curved surfaces, quadratic patches. And technically, The math was arguably more elegant, fewer shapes for smoother curves. Then Microsoft released Direct 3D, and Direct 3D used triangles. The entire industry standardized around triangles in about 10 minutes, and NVIDIA's beautiful, elegant chip was suddenly a chip that spoke a language nobody else spoke. The product got returned, stores sent back inventory in bulk, and the company that was supposed to be the next big thing was, in Jensen's own words, about 30 days from running out of money. They cut the company from over 100 people down to about 40. And now comes my favorite decision in this entire story. They had a contract with Sega. Sega was building a new console, what became the Dreamcast, and NVIDIA was supposed to deliver the graphics chip. That contract was the only real money they had coming in. And Jensen went to Sega and told them the truth. Our architecture is wrong. We're not going to finish this. You should go find another supplier. Then, and this is the audacious part, he asked them to pay NVIDIA anyway. Sega's president at the time was Shoichiro Irimajiri. He didn't have to do anything. He could have sued them into a crater. Instead, he paid. $5 million, Sega went and used a different chip in the Dreamcast, and that $5 million bought NVIDIA about 6 more months of oxygen. Jensen has said publicly, many times, that without Irimajiri, there is no NVIDIA. A company that is now worth trillions of dollars exists because one executive in Japan decided to be generous to a partner who had just admitted failure. How often does that happen? So they had 6 months. And they did something insane with it. Normally, when you design a chip, you build a test version, find the bugs, fix them, build another one. Each round costs a fortune and takes months. They couldn't afford even one round of that. So they spent a huge chunk of their remaining cash on emulation systems, machines that let them run the chip in software before it physically existed. And they bet the entire company on getting it right on the first try. No do-overs, one shot. The chip was the Reva 128. It came out in 1997. It used triangles, obviously, lesson learned, and it sold something like 1 million units in 4 months. That's the moment NVIDIA stops being a story about dying and starts being a story about winning. They IPO'd in January 1999, and later that year they shipped a chip called the GeForce 256, and they did something clever with it. The chip could handle a step called transform and lighting all by itself. Basically, working out where every object sits in 3D space and how light hits it, which the CPU used to have to do. But the clever part wasn't the engineering. It was that NVIDIA called it a GPU. Graphics Processing Unit. That term didn't exist before. They made it up. They named the category they were about to dominate. And by 2000, their biggest rival, 3DFX, was bankrupt. And NVIDIA bought the pieces. Okay? So that's the first act. Scrappy underdog nearly dies, comes back, wins the gaming market. Now the second act. And this is the one that actually matters. Around 2003, a Stanford PhD student named Ian Buck was doing something weird. He was taking graphics cards, which are designed to draw video games, and tricking them into doing general math. He'd hand the chip a problem disguised as a picture, let it do the calculation, and read the answer back out of the pixels. It was a horrible hack, but it was fast. Because remember, thousands of simple things at once. That's not just how you draw a screen. That's how you do an enormous amount of scientific math. He built a system for it called Brook. NVIDIA hired him in 2004, and in 2006, they released the thing that made everything else possible, CUDA. CUDA is just a way to write normal software that runs on the graphics chip. That's it. That's the whole idea. Stop pretending your physics simulation is a video game and just write the physics. And here's the part that should genuinely impress you. To make CUDA work, NVIDIA had to change the actual silicon. Every single chip they made, but including the ones going into gaming PCs where nobody would ever use CUDA, had to carry extra circuitry to support it. That made the chips bigger, more expensive, and less profitable. They did it anyway, on every chip, for years. Jensen has said they spent something in the order of $10 billion on this before it made real money. Wall Street was not amused. Analysts asked repeatedly why a gaming company was subsidizing a science project. The stock went basically nowhere for years. There were layoffs. There was a hardware defect scandal in laptop chips that cost them hundreds of millions. In 2008, the stock lost most of its value. And through all of it, they kept shipping CUDA in every card to every university for free, which meant that by around 2010, if you were a graduate student anywhere in the world with an idea that needed serious computing power, the cheapest supercomputer you could possibly get was a gaming card from NVIDIA sitting in your desktop. Now, September 2012. A researcher at Stanford named Fei Li had spent years building something called ImageNet, a database of millions of labeled photographs, and running an annual contest to see whose software could recognize them best. Progress had been slow, grinding. A percentage point here, a percentage point there. Then a team from the University of Toronto entered, Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and their supervisor, Jeffrey Hinton. Hinton had been working on neural networks, like software loosely modeled on brain cells, for decades through long stretches where the entire field thought the idea was a dead end. The math had been there for years. What was missing was raw computing power to train the things. Krzyzewski trained their network, AlexNet, on two GeForce GTX 580 gaming cards in a bedroom, consumer hardware you could buy at a computer store. And it didn't just win, it demolished the field. The error rate dropped by roughly 10 percentage points in a single year, which in that world is not an improvement, it's an earthquake. Everyone in machine learning looked at that result and then looked at what it ran on, and the entire field basically stood up and walked toward NVIDIA at the same time. That's the moment. Not a boardroom, a bedroom, two gaming cards, and a decade of software that NVIDIA had already given away for free. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to say NVIDIA saw AI coming. They didn't, not exactly. Jensen has been fairly honest about that, though they believed in parallel computing as a general idea and they pushed it everywhere they could. When AI showed up, it happened to be the most valuable parallel problem in human history. But here's the thing about luck. NVIDIA had spent 10 years building a surfboard that everybody said was pointless. When the wave finally came, they were the only ones holding one. From there, the story accelerates so hard it stops feeling real. In 2016, Jensen personally hand-delivered NVIDIA's first AI supercomputer to a small nonprofit lab in San Francisco called OpenAI. In 2017, a team at Google published a paper called Attention is All You Need, which introduced the transformer, the architecture behind basically every AI system you've used. Transformers are enormously hungry for exactly the kind of parallel math NVIDIA chips do. Then, in late 2022, ChatGPT lands, and the entire world discovers this at once. And in May 2023, NVIDIA reported earnings and told investors that the next quarter would be around $11 billion, when analysts had been expecting about $7 billion. The stock jumped roughly 24% in one day and added something like $180 billion of market value, the biggest single-day gain any company had ever had. They crossed $1 trillion in 2023, $2 trillion in early 2024, $3 trillion a few months after that. In 2025, they became the first company in history to be worth $4 trillion. The dishwashers company, from the Denny's booth. So what's the actual lesson here for you, sitting there not running a chip company? It's not buy the stock, and I'm not going to tell you what to do with your money. Honestly, the more interesting thing is the shape of the story, because the two decisions that built NVIDIA both looked stupid at the time. Telling Sega you'd failed and asking for money anyway. Stupid. Putting expensive circuitry that gamers didn't want on every chip for a decade. Stupid, expensive, and unpopular, with the exact people whose opinion supposedly mattered. And the thing that saved the company wasn't a prediction. It was a conviction that they held long enough to become right about. Jensen still says the same line to his employees that he said in 1996, when it was literally true. Our company is 30 days from going out of business. Trillions of dollars later, he still says it. That's not a motivational poster. That's a man who remembers exactly how close it got. So, that booth in San Jose, I said at the start that the guy who used to bust those tables ended up running the most valuable company on earth, and that's true. And it's a nice line. But I think I framed it wrong. Because the point isn't that he escaped the diner. Jensen has said more than once that being a dishwasher was the best job he ever had, and that he still thinks of himself as the guy who takes on the job nobody else wants. Cleaning the toilets in Kentucky, telling Sega the truth, spending a decade building software for a market that didn't exist yet. The diner isn't the thing he left behind, it's the thing he brought with him. Anyway, that's the story. Next time you see one of those charts of the biggest companies in the world, just remember that the one at the top started as three tired engineers, a booth, and a chip that was completely, catastrophically wrong. I'm Chio. See you in the next video.